the King of Iceland, the convict who stole a nation for 12 days. On June 26, 1809, a Danish adventurer with a criminal record, a talent for languages, and absolutely no legitimate claim to power, marched into the governor's residence in Reykjavik and declared himself the absolute ruler of Iceland. His name was Jørgen Jørgensen, and for 12 extraordinary days, this convicted gambler and debtor became the de facto king of an entire nation. It was one of the most audacious political coups in history, not because of military brilliance or popular revolution, but because Jorgensen simply walked in and took over a country that nobody was paying attention to. Iceland, caught in the crossfire of the Napoleonic Wars, found itself ruled by a man whose previous claims to fame included being imprisoned for debt in England and working as a naval officer for the British Royal Navy. This is the story of how a charismatic con man became a revolutionary, how a forgotten island became a pawn in European power politics, and how one man's 12-day reign earned him the nickname Jorgen the Dog Days King, a title that captures both the brevity of his rule and the contempt with which history has judged him. The making of an adventurer. Jørgen Jørgensen was born in Copenhagen, Denmark, in March 1780, into a respectable family. His father was a royal watchmaker, a position of some prestige in the Danish court. Young Jørgen should have followed a conventional path, perhaps inheriting his father's trade, settling into comfortable middle-class respectability. Instead, he went to sea. By his teenage years, Jorgensen was sailing on Danish merchant vessels, learning navigation, and developing the wanderlust that would define his entire life. He had a gift for languages, eventually becoming fluent in Danish, English, French, German, and Icelandic. He was intelligent, charming when he wanted to be, and possessed the kind of restless energy that makes some men entrepreneurs and others criminals, sometimes both. In 1801, during the Napoleonic Wars, Jorgensen found himself in Britain just as Denmark aligned with Napoleon's France. The British, never ones to waste useful talent, recruited him into the Royal Navy. For several years, he served aboard British warships, sailing to exotic locations and learning the art of naval warfare. But Jorgensen had expensive tastes and a gambling problem. By 1806, he was deep in debt to London creditors. Unable to pay, he was thrown into debtor's prison, a common fate in early 19th century Britain, where debt was treated almost like a criminal offense. He spent over a year behind bars, plenty of time to nurse his grievances and dream of greater things. When he was finally released in 1807, Jorgensen needed money and opportunity. He found both in the person of Samuel Phelps, a British soap merchant with an unusual business proposal, a trading expedition to Iceland. Iceland, Europe's forgotten colony. To understand how someone could simply take over Iceland, you need to understand what Iceland was in 1809, an isolated, impoverished, and almost completely forgotten Danish colony in the North Atlantic. Iceland had been under Danish rule since 1380, when the Kalmar Union brought the Scandinavian kingdoms together. For centuries, it had been a neglected backwater, its population of barely 50,000 people struggling to survive on fishing, sheep farming, and whatever they could grow in the brief Arctic summer. The island had no army, no significant fortifications, and only a handful of Danish administrators to represent royal authority. The governor, Count Frederick Christopher Tramp, ruled from Reykjavik, then a tiny settlement of wooden houses, hardly worthy of the name city. The entire government apparatus consisted of maybe a dozen officials. When the Napoleonic Wars erupted across Europe, Iceland became a casualty of geography. Denmark sided with Napoleon, which meant Britain, dominant naval power of the age, blockaded Danish territories. Iceland, dependent on trade with Denmark for basic supplies like grain, was cut off. The population faced starvation. British merchant ships occasionally ran the blockade to trade with desperate Icelanders, exchanging goods for Icelandic fish and wool. This was technically illegal, but profit mattered more than politics to entrepreneurial traders. Samuel Phelps was one of these opportunistic merchants, and Jørgen Jørgensen, with his knowledge of both Danish and English, was the perfect interpreter and facilitator. The mission that became a revolution. In December 1808, Jorgensen and Phelps sailed for Iceland aboard the merchant ship Clarence. They arrived in Reykjavik in January 1809, seeking to establish trading relationships despite the British blockade. Initially, the mission went smoothly. The Icelandic population was desperate for trade goods, and local merchants were happy to deal with anyone who could provide them. But Governor Tramp was suspicious. These were British merchants trading in defiance of Danish law, with a Danish citizen, Jorgensen, apparently working for the enemy. Tramp arrested Jorgensen and confiscated the cargo of the Clarence. This was within his authority as Danish governor, but it was a catastrophic miscalculation. He had underestimated both Jorgensen's ambition and the weakness of his own position. Jorgensen, once released, began to see opportunity where others saw only isolation. Iceland was defenseless. Denmark was too busy fighting Napoleon's wars to pay attention to a remote North Atlantic colony. Britain controlled the seas but had no interest in annexing Iceland. The governor had minimal military force and even less support from the local population, who resented Danish trade monopolies that kept them poor. Why not, Jorgensen reasoned, simply take over? The 12-Day Revolution. On June 26, 1809, Jorgensen made his move. Backed by a small force of British sailors from the Clarence and Margaret and Anne, another merchant vessel that had arrived, he marched to Governor Tramp's residence. There was no battle. Tramp, facing armed men and with no military force to defend him, was simply arrested and placed aboard one of the British ships. Jorgensen then issued a proclamation declaring Iceland's independence from Denmark and establishing himself as His Excellency the Protector of Iceland, Commander-in-Chief by sea and land. It was a coup accomplished with minimal violence, essentially a hostile takeover of a nation-state by a convicted debtor and a handful of British sailors who probably thought the whole thing was a lark. Jorgensen moved quickly to legitimize his rule. He issued a series of proclamations and decrees, all written in both Icelandic and English. He declared that Iceland was now free from Danish tyranny. He promised to end the Danish trade monopoly and open Iceland to free trade with all nations. He established himself as the supreme authority, taking control of the government apparatus and the treasury. He even created a flag for his new nation, 3 white cod on a blue background. Fish, after all, were Iceland's main resource, and Jorgensen had a flair for symbolism. Playing king for 12 days, Jørgen Jørgensen was the absolute ruler of Iceland. He held court, issued proclamations, and made grand plans for the future of his island kingdom. He declared all Danish property in Iceland confiscated. He promised reforms to benefit the Icelandic population, who had long chafed under Danish colonial restrictions. He appointed new officials to replace the Danish administrators. He behaved in every way like a legitimate head of state, albeit one with a very thin claim to authority. The Icelandic people's reaction was mixed. Some saw Jorgensen as a liberator, a man who had freed them from Danish exploitation. Others viewed him as just another foreign opportunist, replacing one master with another. Many simply waited to see what would happen next, a pragmatic response from a population that had survived centuries by adapting to whoever held power. Jorgensen's biggest problem wasn't popular resistance, it was legitimacy. He had no legal authority, no recognition from any government, and no military force beyond a couple of merchant ships with small crews. His entire revolution was built on the temporary absence of any real power in Iceland. That absence wouldn't last long. The British arrive on August 7, 1809. The British Royal Navy warship HMS Talbot, commanded by Captain Alexander Jones, sailed into Reykjavik harbor. Jones had been sent to Iceland on a routine patrol, checking on British interest during the Napoleonic blockade. He was not expecting to find a rogue Danish adventurer claiming to rule the country. Captain Jones was unimpressed with Jorgensen's revolution. Britain had no desire to annex Iceland or to support independence movements that might complicate British-Danish relations. Jones viewed the entire situation as a farce that needed to be ended before it created diplomatic problems. On August 22, 1809, Jones landed with a detachment of Royal Marines and arrested Jørgen Jørgensen. There was no resistance. Jorgensen, ever the pragmatist, recognized when he was beaten. His 12-day reign was over. Jones also arrested Governor Trampa and several other Danish officials, taking them back to Britain as prisoners of war. But he restored formal Danish authority in Iceland, leaving the colony in the hands of Icelandic officials until Denmark could reassert control after the war. Jorgensen was taken back to London in chains. His revolutionary government dissolved as quickly as it had been created. What history made of him? The British press had a field day with Jorgensen's escapade. Newspapers mockingly called him His Majesty of Iceland and the Dog Days King, a reference to the brief period in summer, the Dog Days. When he had held power, he was something between a curiosity and a joke, a con man who had managed to steal a country for nearly 2 weeks. Editorial cartoonists drew caricatures of him wearing a makeshift crown, presiding over a kingdom of sheep and fishermen. But Jorgensen's story was far from over. After his arrest, he was held in Britain, but not formally prosecuted. The British government wasn't quite sure what to do with him. He hadn't committed treason. He was Danish, not British. His revolution had harmed no British interests. And frankly, the whole incident was more embarrassing than criminal. Eventually, he was released, and what followed was a life so extraordinary, it deserves its own epic. Jorgensen became a British spy, traveling through Europe, gathering intelligence during the final years of the Napoleonic Wars. He wrote books about Iceland and his adventures. He got involved in radical politics in London. In 1826, he was convicted of theft and transported to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania, Australia. Even there, his talents found use. He became a police constable, then a magistrate's clerk. then an explorer who helped map parts of Tasmania's interior. He wrote prolifically about Australian Aboriginal peoples and the natural history of the island. Jørgen Jørgensen died in Hobart, Tasmania in 1841 at the age of 61. He had been a sailor, a gambler, a debtor, a spy, a revolutionary, a convict, a police officer, an explorer, and a writer. He had ruled Iceland for 12 days and ended his life on the opposite side of the world, still telling stories about his adventures. Iceland's forgotten declaration. For Iceland, Jorgensen's revolution became a historical footnote, an odd incident in the long struggle for independence that wouldn't be fully achieved until 1944. Most Icelanders probably viewed the whole affair as a temporary disruption, barely worth remembering. But in some ways, Jorgensen planted a seed. He was the first person to formally declare Iceland's independence, even if his declaration had no legitimacy. He articulated the idea that Iceland could be something other than a Danish colony. He demonstrated, however farcically, that the Danish grip on Iceland was weak. When Iceland finally did achieve independence during World War II, it wasn't because of Jorgensen's precedent, but his failed revolution remained a curious footnote in the national story, a reminder that sometimes history's path runs through the strangest detours. The psychology of the conman king. What drove Jørgen Jørgensen to attempt something so audacious? Ambition, certainly. Opportunism, without doubt. But also a peculiar kind of vision that con men and revolutionaries sometimes share. The ability to see possibilities that conventional people dismiss as impossible. Jorgensen looked at Iceland and saw not an impregnable fortress, but an undefended door. He recognized that power is sometimes just a question of who's willing to walk through that door and claim it. In 1809, nobody was guarding Iceland. The Danes were distracted by war. The British didn't care about the island except as a trading post. The Icelanders had no military capacity to resist or support anyone. Into this power vacuum stepped a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. For 12 days, sheer audacity was enough. This is the pattern of many historical opportunists. They exploit the moments when traditional authority breaks down, when nobody is quite sure who's in charge or what the rules are. Jorgensen's revolution succeeded, however briefly, because he acted while everyone else hesitated. Legacy of the Dog Days King today. Jørgen Jørgensen is remembered in Iceland with a mixture of amusement and bemusement. There are no statues of him in Reykjavik. He's not celebrated as a national hero, but he appears in history books as an odd footnote, a colorful character in the larger story of Icelandic independence. In Denmark, he is barely remembered at all, just another adventurer in an age full of them, a minor embarrassment in the long history of Danish colonial administration. In Britain, he's occasionally mentioned in histories of the Napoleonic era, usually as an example of the kind of eccentric characters that filled the period's fringes. In Tasmania, some local historians remember him as an early explorer and ethnographer. His criminal past and royal pretensions in Iceland just one chapter in a remarkably diverse life. The three white cod on a blue background, the flag Jorgensen designed for his independent Iceland, never flew again after his arrest. But the idea it represented that Iceland could be independent eventually came true, just not in the way Jorgensen imagined, and not for another 135 years. Lessons from a failed king. What can we learn from Jorgensen's brief reign? Perhaps that in times of chaos and transition, the established order is more fragile than it appears. That sometimes the difference between a revolutionary and a con man is just a matter of timing and success. That history is filled with might-have-beens and failed experiments that nevertheless leave their mark. Jorgensen's revolution failed not because Icelanders rejected it, but because a British warship happened to sail into harbor at the wrong time. If Captain Jones had arrived a few months later, if Britain had decided to support Icelandic independence as a way to weaken Denmark, if any number of contingencies had broken differently, Jorgensen might be remembered as Iceland's George Washington, rather than as a historical curiosity. But history doesn't deal in might-have-beens. It deals in what actually happened. And what actually happened was that a convicted debtor with big ideas ruled Iceland for 12 summer days in 1809 before being unceremoniously arrested and shipped back to London. Conclusion: the convict who almost stole a nation. Jørgen Jørgensen's story is ultimately about ambition unmoored from conventional limitations. He saw an opportunity that nobody else saw, or that others saw but dismissed as impossible. For 12 days, his vision was reality. He issued proclamations, made laws, and governed Iceland with absolute authority. Then it ended, as audacious schemes usually do, with practical men arriving to restore order and common sense. But for those 12 days, in the summer of 1809, a convicted gambler and debtor was the king of Iceland, ruling from Reykjavik over a population that barely knew what to make of him. History has not been kind to Jørgen Jørgensen. He's remembered, when he's remembered at all, as the Dog Days King, a con man who briefly fooled an isolated island into accepting his authority. But perhaps there's something admirable in his sheer audacity, his willingness to risk everything on an impossible gamble. He failed, of course, but for 12 glorious days, Jørgen Jørgensen proved that sometimes the most unlikely people can change history, even if history eventually erases or mocks their achievements. He remains one of the most colorful characters in Iceland's long story, a reminder that truth is often stranger than any fiction we could imagine. The convict who stole a nation may not have kept it, but he certainly left a story worth telling.